I actually have some news to break to you guys. Some time ago, I went to the doctors and had a doctor do a few tests on me, and sadly I was diagnosed with a condition called being a pussy-ass bitch. Because of my condition, I unfortunately cannot appreciate horror games or horror movies. If I even attempt to play a typical horror game, I have to yell the words, "fuck this," then run to the nearest store, buy a Bible, and sleep next to the Bible that night. This has left me missing out on some of the greatest horror games throughout the years. With Halloween around the corner, I thought I'd let people know about this Horror-Lite game I've been playing around this spooky time of year. Alan Wake is a psychological action thriller that came out back in 2010. The game may be advertised as a psychological action thriller, but the game tries to be a horror game at heart. If you don't believe me, it has the horror tag on Steam, so that's like official. I remember playing it back in the day before my condition took full effect on my life, and I kinda enjoyed it. I would have kept playing it, but there were other games that came out around that time that I wanted to get to. But I'm what some folks call an R-patient gamer, so now that I have a YouTube channel and Halloween is topical, this game is the next one on my bucket list of games to play. Since it's now the season for scary stuff, this kinda conflicts with my debilitating condition. This is also my explanation for why I'm not reviewing the new Amnesia or Phasma, or that one, which is like more topical and probably a scarier game. Alan Wake is a better fit for me because it still has all the elements of a scary game, but doesn't make me have to buy any more Bibles, which is great because I just can't afford any more Bibles. Luckily, unlike back in 2010, this game is much more of a bargain, and you could find it through Xbox Game Pass for essentially free. Hell, they just give this game away for free these days, so this is less of a review to see if this game is worth buying, and more to see if this game is worth your time at all. Hi, my name's Ben, I like to talk about video games, and today I'm going to be reviewing Alan Wake. Alan Wake is a linear shooter and is basically a homage to Stephen King novels and Twin Peaks. I haven't seen any of Twin Peaks, but I'm very familiar with King's work. Our protagonist is, surprise, Alan Wake. Alan is a writer, and you can already start to see the similarities to King's novels right there. Except unlike Stephen King, Alan is in a writer's block, and decides to go on vacation with his wife, who supposedly is a beautiful woman. They head to a town called Bright Falls, but creepy stuff happens at Bright Falls, and it's up to Alan to save his plain wife. Alan's time in Bright Falls is one wrapped in mystery. It's obvious supernatural stuff is going on, but the reason behind it is unclear, and there's an obvious connection between him and this supernatural stuff. I'm sure you're thinking, okay, that's enough of the story and the groundwork for the game and all that other boring stuff. I like to be spooked. How spook is this game? Not much, I'd say. Our game takes place in an area surrounded by dark forests. While it can be scary going through this forest, especially once you find out that there are axe murderers lurking in the woods, after about one or two of these enemies, you quickly find out that they're just rednecks, who are the main cannon fodder in the game that you kill in small packs of 2 or 3. After a while, they become simple enemies, so they lose their scare power that they have fast. Environments can be used to scare you, like surprising you around a corner, and this game isn't afraid to pull out a jump scare. As a matter of fact, they try to scare you with the same jump scare over and over. I don't know if this is a tasteful way to do jump scares, or it's just lazy even for jump scare standards. All I know is that this game will surprise you at times, but whatever kind of horror this game has wears off quick. What replaces the horror is some tension that comes up naturally during the gameplay. So, as far as this game goes for being a horror game, I wouldn't say it makes the cut. Which is great for me because my doctor told me one of the side effects of my condition is unintended leakage, and I do not want to find out what that means. You might be thinking that this game isn't really trying to go for horror, but I think that it is. There's a good amount of stuff in this game that supports this, and random bits of it will come up over the review. One thing that's a big deal in horror games is its visual and sound design, so let's talk about that first. Bright Falls is located in a lovely mountain setting next to a lake, and it seems like a small town that wouldn't be anything special if it wasn't located around such beautiful scenery. And it is beautiful. Maybe it's because I'm playing this game on a mid-range PC 10 years after it was initially released, but this game looks fantastic. This game was ported a couple years after its initial release, and apparently was enhanced for PC. It shows. Once you adjust the brightness to as dark as possible, and you turn down the sensitivity to your liking, this game is pleasant to look at. Environments are great with forests that look natural, trees fill your vision enough to let you know that you're in a thick forest, but also block your vision just enough so you can't be sure if there's anything, or anyone, behind those forest trees. Lighting looks great, and you can really feel the light shooting from your flashlight and enveloping you in the street lamps that make the light look like a heavenly beam sent to protect you. Houses and cabins have enough in them to not feel barren, but not so much stuff that you feel like it's overloaded with detail like in some games. When you're in moment-to-moment gameplay, these visuals hold up and run smooth. I never felt the game chug along and have the frame rate issues that I've seen reported online. It's hard to gauge how many frames I was getting with just eyeballing it, but I could safely say 60 or more with no dips. Character models look good when you give them a passing look, but up close? Good God. Why does everyone's face do that when they're supposed to be talking? Sometimes you just have to say the sad truth about a game that tries to be realistic with their visuals that they've fallen into the uncanny valley. This game doesn't even get to uncanny valley level though. Uncanny Valley happens when a character models and animations look close to realistic but miss the mark enough to make us feel uncomfortable. While this game's models look passable, I guess, their animation doesn't give off a "I'm a real human" vibe. In cutscenes, I'm very aware that I'm looking at a game. I get that we all can't be Naughty Dog, but this was bad even for the time. During the gameplay, it's great. This game aged well during its combat and exploration segments, or when watching enemies and objects move. Alan Wake does do a run that I'm not going to make fun of, but for the most part, animations are pretty good when you're in control. Unfortunately, the cutscenes just didn't age along with this game. The developers of Alan Wake were Remedy Entertainment. They are partially known for making Max Payne's original face, but Remedy needed more time to make visuals look consistently good. Those guys would go on to make Quantum Break, and that game looks great. If you look closely, it almost looks like real life. Let's talk about the audio part of the game. Audio typically isn't my strong suit when it comes to reviewing games. Neither is dissecting gameplay or story, and I'm not really good at judging visuals either. Good thing my jokes are always on point. Bro. Sound design is a bit of a mixed bag. Some stuff sounds great and others sound passable. In most games, this is okay. Sound design is an unsung hero in games though, and its impact is much more pronounced in horror games. Having a sharp whine shoot off while you're shining a flashlight at an enemy, or hearing the world warp around you, and hearing floorboards creak from the footsteps and you aren't too sure where the sound is coming from can make for an unsettling experience. But there are times when certain thuds don't hit right and voice acting has problems and the game wants to make those typical horror sounds. You know the ones I'm talking about. Ones that sound just like a messed up piano that's just sort of like, "Arr!" It's stuff like this that lets me know what kind of genre they were aiming for. I think people who are trying to be scared while playing Alan Wake will be disappointed slowly over the course of the game. But people that are like me, with an awful condition like the one I have, will appreciate what this game does. It gives you a horror game feel without ever feeling like too much. It's definitely scares that are easy to overcome, which is good for me, but probably not the best thing when you're in the horror genre. Let's talk about the story. I always feel lame whenever I call a campaign or a single-player mode or the narrative a story, but I do so many things like a 5-year-old, may as well talk about the story this game tells. Alan Wake's story rests on the mystery surrounding why your wife is missing and why all this supernatural stuff is going on. It's a mystery that can seem like it'd be easy to figure out, but you always feel like you're 1 or 2 clues away from getting the whole story down. Where this starts to fall apart is when 1 or 2 clues never really feel truly explained. There are twists and turns that try to tell you from this game's mystery, but those bits that try to confuse you just left me kind of wishing the story went in a different direction. If what I'm saying seems vague and confusing, then you feel the same way I felt when I had the plot points told to me. Let's talk about some more concrete stuff that won't go too terribly into spoilers. Alan's motive for going through this game is to find his wife. She disappeared under weird circumstances, and we have to jump through a few hoops to find her. As far as motives go, it works well for Alan, but as a player, I don't care about this girl. She's one of those love interests that's so into you she forgot how to have a personality. The way she's animated makes her come across as creepy at times, and like I said earlier, she's implied to be beautiful, but I mean, no. She looks like one of those white girls who are trying to make their eyebrows look better, but in the process, they just make themselves look like they have even more fucked up eyebrows. I mean, I'm fine and all for having a plain wife, and she doesn't need to be some sort of prom queen with better eyebrows. I just think they didn't really give the player too many reasons to care about her. Other characters just show up to make the game a little more interesting and give Alan somebody to talk to instead of having Alan narrate the story in his head. Which is something he does. Alan is a decent character, but he's a good narrator. He's voiced by Matthew Peretta, and Peretta really does enhance Alan's character. Matthew gave Alan that writer vibe, while also making Alan an everyman at the same time. Alan narrates actions he does with an inner monologue in the same vein as a first-person narrator. He tells us what's happening as though he's reading pages from a book he wrote. I enjoyed his narration, and it made Alan, who really is just a simple guy, feel much more like a character we can get behind. Too bad there are times when Alan can narrate a little too much. He can sometimes give helpful tips telling you minor objectives you need to complete to move on, which can be nice in any of those rare instances where you're stuck. Sometimes he does that whole tell us how we should feel about something, or describe something we can clearly see in front of us as the player. It happens enough to wish that Alan would just hush up a bit. The inner monologue does get rid of stupid things we see in video games where characters talk to themselves to let us know how they feel. Alan's narration does this for us, and it's written more like a novel to fit this game's aesthetic. As I said before though, Alan is a simple guy. He only wants to save his wife, but he doesn't really want much else. He also doesn't really have any emotions that come up that feel natural. Even when he's supposed to be afraid, he doesn't feel like he is. I hope this game wasn't trying to get the player to be afraid on Alan's behalf, because it isn't scary enough to do that. There isn't much else I can say about his character without straight up spoiling things, so I'm just going to leave my thoughts on Alan at that. All in all, I think they went in the right direction with Alan's voice acting. It was so strong that it didn't make me care that there wasn't much else to Alan. I wish as much can be said about almost any other character. It seems the voice acting budget was blown on Alan, because voice acting can really be all over the place in this game. Some characters can sound alright and even be considered good, and other characters can feel like they are really voicing a character in a video game. As I said earlier, characters can show up to make things a bit more interesting, like Alan's agent/best friend Barry. Barry is what I assume was supposed to be comedic relief, but he's more so annoying. He never really bothered me though, because he at least added a bit of entertainment to the cast of rarely notable characters. By the way, if you ever want to know what I look like in real life, I kinda look like Barry. That isn't really a joke either, I just have the same jacket in blue. Other characters show up just to do nothing and confuse the story some more. Sometimes their addition works, and other times I feel like they should have just been cut at the writer's table. Alan Wake has some interesting inspirations. There's obviously a huge Stephen King inspiration, but some of the cutscenes that are integral for the plot give a huge B-movie vibe. I don't think it really goes into campy territory, but the cutscenes and dialogue will come really close. I think the comparison to Stephen King books makes a lot of sense. As for the story of this game, it makes me think of many Stephen King related media. Outside of a few outliers, most of the books King has written isn't really considered amongst the literature community to be great works outside of their genre. King has built up his deserved fame for making horror novels that are creative, and making a fuck ton of them as well. Some of them get made into great movies, some don't. Some of the movies or TV shows get translated weird and make you think that there was a weird transition from book to whatever it's being translated to. Maybe this game was trying to be a weird transition from a book to a game for a book that never existed. Maybe it's supposed to feel like a movie version of a book that was intentionally strangely adapted. Or maybe the inspiration is more on the Twin Peaks side of things and just meant to be off-putting. Or maybe I'm just thinking about it too much and I just really need to get off this goofy topic. Since there's a mystery that's central to this game's story, it can keep you actually hooked for a good length of time. Somewhere around the midpoint, or at least for me, the game's twists and turns don't seem to do too much. It was around this certain part of the game that I wanted to start getting some clear answers. As a matter of fact, some of the conversations that are meant to clear things up don't clear it up enough, or just info dump a lot of the plot on you. If the storytelling in this game actually grabs you in a way it's intended to, then it's going to be great. For most people, this game's going to drag for you, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th episode. Remedy could have shaved this game down by an episode, and I bet it would have made for a better experience. It's a creative story, but one that doesn't make for something I feel stands on its own outside of being a game in the horror genre. Very Stephen King-esque. Okay, so there's one thing about this game's story, kill me please, that I want to talk about that goes slightly, and I mean slightly, into spoilers. I'm not really going to spoil much of the plot because I don't plan to go that in depth with this game. And trust me, I can talk your ears off about it, but I don't want to make this video too long. I've read advice that recommends making shorter videos for new YouTubers like me, but just ask my mom and my high school counselor about how awful I am at taking advice. I'll timestamp the video so you can skip, but you don't really need to worry too much about what I'm going to spoil. The main antagonist of Alan Wake uses, and technically is, the darkness that Alan fights throughout the game. Alan even says that when writing supernatural elements into stories, that these supernatural elements are symbolic of some sort of human element that needs to be addressed. The supernatural element in this game is, of course, the darkness. The problem here though is that, even though everything in the story is explained within the game, what the darkness is symbolic for is left up to interpretation. I'm still not even sure what the darkness is all about. I've seen some people online theorize that it's the negative parts of Alan's emotions, or that it's about his substance abuse. I initially thought that it was either what was at the root of his writer's block, or it was his writer's block itself. The problem with these theories is that I don't think there's too much ground to go on here within just this game. There is DLC and a sequel to this game, and some people try to connect those games to solve what the darkness means. I think the fact that the darkness being pointed out as a symbolic element so early on in the game shows that they had ideas within this game to figure out what they were supposed to represent. If it's Alan's anger that the darkness is supposed to represent, then why doesn't he lose his anger more often, or why doesn't the darkness get worse when he gets angry? If it's his substance abuse, why does the game only reference drinking twice? According to an article released in Edge magazine back in 2012, they interviewed Sam Lake, the creative director at Remedy Entertainment. He says that the darkness is supposed to represent madness, terror, death, and nightmares, and the light is supposed to represent sanity and safety. If that's the case, I think it's a poorly implemented symbol then. There are never any conversations about Alan's sanity outside of one specific event. That one specific event is actually the last point I was interested in the story, if I'm being honest. I think there was more that they could do with the symbolic design that they were coming up with, and I think that there was a few directions they wanted to go, but they all just petered out. Here's what I think happened. And I'm going to use the game Kingdom Hearts as a reference. If you don't know much about me, which you probably don't, I look like Barry in real life, and I only know anything about 2 franchises, Kingdom Hearts and Naruto. So that should show you how serious you should take my opinions. See, in Kingdom Hearts, the darkness was supposed to be a simple metaphor for evil inside people's hearts. If you were greedy, malicious, or fat, you would be more enveloped in the darkness. But as time went on, even within the first game, the darkness stopped being a symbol for something and started being a tangible force and a character within itself. It makes it easier to write. That way, you don't need to think about what the Keyblade or the flashlight in Alan Wake is symbolic for, and why it's able to destroy the darkness. It's just easier to write, and that's what I think happened here. The darkness was supposed to be something that represented Alan being a bad guy, and something Alan needed to overcome to be a better person. As the story went on, though, the darkness just became a thing that liked evil. There were some development problems with the game that come up in the same interviews, so maybe there were some issues with the story that they originally had. If you disagree, please leave a comment telling me what you think this game was really about, and how I didn't get it, and how much you think I chugged dicks, and why you think my doctor was right about diagnosing me as a pussy-ass bitch. Alan Wake is a unique shooter, for a few reasons. The first reason is that even though it's a third-person shooter, there's no cover mechanics in the game. You just gotta bob and weave. This also isn't your typical shooter because you don't fight people who shoot guns. Instead of your usual dude with an AK-47, in Alan Wake, you fight something much scarier. You fight rednecks with gardening supplies. I get where this game is coming from, I fear the rednecks as well, but as an enemy type, I do wish for a little bit more variety. You fight a whole dive bar's worth of rednecks that grab all sorts of weapons. Some run at you, some throw shit at you, and some are just fat as fuck. Fighting slews of these guys throughout the entirety of the game does get tiring. Luckily, you fight them with an interesting weapon. Good old flashlight. The redneck's excuse for attacking you is that they're corrupted by the darkness. Because of their corruption, the light negatively affects them. So, unlike most games where you hide and shoot from cover, you actually stun enemies with your flashlight. You try to destroy what is basically a protective layer of darkness. Once the darkness is removed, you can solve the redneck problem the same way you would in real life. The flashlight is like a shield you have to manage in this game, that actually takes some skill to pull off. Focusing your flashlight on enemies may stun them, but it'll also drain your flashlight's batteries. There are a limited number of batteries, so figuring out the best time to shine enemies can take some thought. Getting up close to them is a little more dangerous, but you could deplete their protective shield a little bit better. If you run low on light, you can replace the batteries, or you can wait until the battery recharges. If you get overwhelmed with enemies surrounding you, you can try to dodge and bounce out of there, or you could set off a flare which will light up the entire battlefield for you. Sounds like a great system, right? For the most part it is, but it has a couple major flaws. The first is that the game is just too easy. There are a couple parts where difficulty ramps up, they don't last long, and those difficult parts are few and far between. This is one of those games where you can't pick the hardest difficulty until you've beaten the game. Even then, the hardest mode just makes it so that the enemies are bullet sponges instead of making resources scarcer. Making me have to switch between weapons and ammo types and conserve on batteries while having to deal with enemies could have made the game's combat a lot more fun. And it would have made me actually scared of the enemies as well. While I'm making this game sound like an action game, sadly, Alan isn't an athlete. When it gets to bob and weave time, he moves like a fucking jalopy and runs right into an oncoming axe. The second big boy problem this game has is the movement system. Alan's dodge mechanic is tied to his sprint button, and Alan can't dodge during certain actions like setting off a flare. So there'll be a ton of times where you want to do a super precise action, and Alan will stop acting like a Pulitzer Prize winner, and instead act like a Darwin Award winner. This isn't always bad. The game slows down to give you a cinematic vibe whenever you successfully pull off a dodge, and can make it satisfying to pull off when it works. This does highlight the more frustrating times though when it doesn't work the way you wanted it to. The movement system in this game just feels so off at all times. This might be because the game was initially made for Xbox and was built around the gamepad, and all we're getting is a port for keyboard and mouse. Not saying the port is bad. Everything looks great. Being able to quickly whip my flashlight from one point to another and back again was really appreciated, so I never felt the need to bust out a controller. The only downside I guess is the whole moving like a jalopy thing. This does seem like a great game for a controller though, assuming the movement feels more natural with the analog stick. I didn't try out the controller because I couldn't get my PS4 controller to work with the game. Or at least it would have taken slightly more work than just plugging it in, but I wasn't willing to risk having to do more work than necessary. Anyways, I mentioned enemy variety earlier. You almost always fight humanoid rednecks, but sometimes you'll fight birds, and sometimes you'll have random objects just thrown at you. Not a joke, random objects are an enemy type in this game. Neither of these are super enjoyable, but they are welcome changes of pace for the enemy types. It helps out with a variety problem, but it doesn't help out a ton. For the most part, you'll just be having that hoedown with the blue collar boys. They do work well as a main enemy type, and if they're put in the right arena, these enemies can be fun to kill. Except the fucking guy who throws stuff. A weird design choice in the game was that if you try to distance yourself from an enemy too much, one type of enemy will throw things at you. This wouldn't be that big of a deal if Alan Wake was somewhat competent on his feet, but seeing as how he's part jalopy, it's hard to maneuver around these throws. I actually like the idea of it, as it creates a situation where you need to manage the distance between you and the enemies better. But if you fuck it up, the best course of action is just to do a jalopy jolt out of there, or just take the hit. I almost always just took the hit and dealt with it because dodging was so difficult to pull off. There's also a bigger brutish enemy that does a charge move at you and is sometimes harder to kill. After they get introduced, like any other enemy types, they quickly become something that's just part of the regular enemies that are thrown at you. I think this is a bit of a problem with the game. While the game tries its hardest outside of certain events and areas, it really just throws a ton of enemies at you, making the game repetitive. Speaking of jalopies, you can drive cars in this game. I was hoping that cars would be something I could make noteworthy in this review, like they were exactly the change of pace that this game needed, or something like that. There's literally nothing special or good to say about the car segments, and they just pad out the game. Let's move on to something a little more important. Level design in Alan Wake is okay. It gets the job done, and any segments that might be boring is saved by the art style and its setting. Your mileage may vary on this one depending on how you feel about forest and the scares the game brings. Levels can just be corridor-ish at times. You'll be walking through forest quite a bit, and while this game does its best to make walking down a trail seem interesting, these really are just wide corridors that have trees or maybe a small cabin in them. Enemies pop out, then you fight them. The change of pace here happens when you're either stripped of mechanics or given new environments to fight in. At times, you'll have to go a stretch without a gun, and someone else will do the shooting. Or you'll be attacked by an overwhelming number of enemies, but you'll have a stationary light fixture to assist you in battle. They run on a timer, so you have to keep that in mind. It adds a layer to the gameplay that keeps it fresh. There are also times when these can be combined with set-piece events that really ramp up the action. These sections made for a much better game, and I appreciated all of them. This might be surprising to hear since I'm being pretty critical, but I like the combat in this game. I think if this game had more interesting scenarios in it, maybe a couple more enemy types or weapons, and a story that actually struck a chord with me, I'd be praising this game up and down. Missing those things makes me feel like this game has potential to be something great, but not much more than the potential it has. Regardless of how I feel, looking at it objectively, I can see a good number of players going through this game being satisfied throughout with the gameplay. For me though, somewhere around the midpoint of the game, I started to check out. This is around the time that I started to notice repetition with the game, kill rednecks, objects thrown at you, more rednecks. I'm half joking about the rednecks being the only enemies, but most of Alan's enemies are blue-collar workers, which really made me wonder why the devs decided to go in this direction. I mean, an upper-class writer from New York who's frightened by blue-collar workers? Seems like they were going somewhere with that, but who knows. Anyways, once the repetition came in, this game became a wait until the cool moments come game. I don't want to talk too much about the set pieces, because if you do decide to play this game, they really are the best parts. Those arenas and set pieces really do make for something that's worth playing through the game. Well, that and the horror setting. So, in conclusion, I like stuff about Alan Wake. I thought the gameplay was almost a hit, but a couple things about it made it jank enough to feel frustrated at times. The story Alan Wake tells starts strong, but it drags in a direction I wasn't in love with. The visuals are great though, or at least great when you're playing the game, and the horror elements are there without being too much. This is a classic situation where you say something like, "There's potential here. I just want to see what these developers can do with this formula." But I'm writing this review in the future. I know what the developers do with this formula. They would go on to make Alan Wake American Nightmare. And it improves some parts of the game while actively taking out other things that were good in this game. Quantum Break wasn't beloved, but the road eventually led down to making Control. And that was a Game of the Year nominee, and looks like it's in the same vein as Alan Wake. Apparently there's a Remedy cinematic universe thing going on with these collections of games, and I need to catch up with it now that I crossed off Alan Wake from my games to play list. So maybe instead of putting off playing these games for 10 years like I did Alan Wake, I can play those games soon. If Alan Wake looks like a game that's interesting to you, and it's on sale, or you got it for free, play it. This game's great for a decent amount of time. Don't be afraid to put the game down though if you start getting bored in the middle of it. While I never thought this game was a marvel in the horror category, I do think Alan Wake had a combat system and a tonal style that was great for building tension. Shining a flashlight on an enemy that's powering through the light, driving towards you with a sledgehammer, and hearing a screeching sound that represents Skeeter's protective darkness fighting to stay on him just long enough for him to try to smash you can make you clench your butt cheeks and pee yourself a little. But like, in a fun way. It never made me scared, but it made me get the rush that horror can bring without making my condition flare up, which is something I always have to keep in mind, especially since my doctor keeps reminding me about it.